To bring the last session to order here. So it's I'd like to thank the Elliott School for hosting this conference and for inviting us all. It's been a great day, and this last panel I think is going to top it all off in a really exciting way, having three of the most eminent scholars of China here to speak with us. So we have, as you know from the program, we have Harry Harding, who's the former dean of the Elliott School here. He's also got interesting private sector experience with the Eurasia Group, a long career with UVA, and all sorts of interesting background, which you can read about in the program. We'll also have Mike Lampton, who's my former colleague, now Professor Emeritus, and the former Director of China Studies at SAIS at Johns Hopkins. Also really interesting background. He used to be president of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and he was a fireman at Stanford, which is something you may not know. Many years ago. And then your own David Shambaugh, who is the Gaston Seeger Professor of Asian Studies and Director of the China Policy Program here at the Elliott School, and author of many books, as all of these guys are. And he also served in the National Security Council. So these people have just very interesting experiences, and I'm really looking forward to what they all have to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everybody. And for those of you who have been here, it's been a long day, and you've heard enough from me if you've been here from the very beginning. So I'll try to keep it brief. And I want to make basically 3 points, both about the future as I see it, and then also how to think about the future, which is probably the most important thing of all. In terms of the future, I'm both limitedly optimistic and also limitedly pessimistic. I'm not optimistic about U.S.-China relations at all. I think we've dug ourselves into a fairly deep hole. Who's responsible for that? I'm not going to say. That's a matter of individual judgment. It'll be hard to get out of it. But in particular, the reason for my limited optimism is that basically, I don't think the Chinese, who have studied game theory very carefully, ever got to the part on basically relative gains. Basically, they tirelessly tell us about win-win situations, win-win outcomes, without asking the relative distribution of costs and benefits within those outcomes. And therefore, even if China wins far more than a partner country, and that country wins something that China can attribute to itself, they think that the other country should be satisfied. And they often will not be. I would simply cite a senior Chinese official who I got to know many years ago, who told me about this in a different way, of course. And he said, we Chinese have a characteristic of being 聪明和不高明. And because that can be translated in many different ways, his assistant came to the rescue and said, what he means is we are clever but not wise. In other words, we don't think about the long-term sustainability of the relationships that we are creating. I think we've seen that in the U.S.-China relationship so far, and I think I see very little sign that the Chinese have turned the page to the economics and game theory textbook to learn about relative gain as well as absolute gain. So I mentioned earlier about the paper that David Shambaugh helped me write, helped me publish, both on patterns of cooperation in the foreign relations of China. I think that there are real problems, the two sides cooperating. So I'm limitedly optimistic. However, limitedly pessimistic. I think that I worry living most of the year now in Taiwan. We all worry about war in the Taiwan Strait. But I think that the Chinese want to avoid the war because it will be very, very costly to them. And it might not absolutely win. It might not succeed in bringing Taiwan under their control. And they cannot afford failure on this point. They will certainly try to use coercion against Taiwan in various ways of threatening the use of force, of trying to, in a way, subvert Taiwan to cause disharmony and so forth, to argue the United States is not trustworthy, won't come to help. But the Chinese will follow a little bit of their own, another aspect of their kind of rich folk history, legacy of strategic thinking, and to say, following Sun Tzu, that the best way to win a war is without fighting. So you go up to that point and try to win by coercion, but not necessarily by the actual use of force. For the sake of my wife and myself, since we live there, I sure hope this prediction has a high degree of accuracy. But I think at least for the foreseeable future, it is. So I'm limitedly optimistic, limitedly pessimistic. But let me talk about predicting the future. For those of you who were here this morning, you noticed that I said that all future predictions have to be both probabilistic and contingent. That is, it's very difficult to predict the future. It's very difficult to do so in absolute terms. As the great philosopher Yogi Berra once put it, prediction is difficult, especially about the future. And it's true because it's so complex. So you have to have a sense of probability to say that this is most likely to happen, maybe 70%, maybe 20%, assign a probability instead of making absolute forecasts, such as the end of history, US-China cooperation is inevitable, decoupling is impossible. Those are both absolute terms and they also are non-probabilistic terms. So you have to think about the future in probabilistic terms and then contingencies. If you have several different outcomes, several different scenarios with different probabilities, that's fine. But then what are the conditions that will have to be present to determine the actual outcome, which forecast, which scenario actually occurs? My last point is to apply that kind of probabilistic and contingent thinking to policy. Policies are, and very few, and I was dean of the school of public policy. And none of my faculty thought exactly this way. They seemed to think that there was much more certainty in applied microeconomic forecasts than I ever thought there really was. But basically apply this kind of thinking in what's called foresight analysis. Policy is a prediction. We predict that if we impose tariffs on China, or if the Chinese say we will demonstrate the use of force against Taiwan, it will have the following outcome. That's a forecast. It has to be probabilistic and contingent. The foresight analysis then goes the next step and says, okay, if it's probabilistic and contingent, how can we attempt to adjust those probabilities and contingencies in our favor? So it's a dynamic process. How do we make it more likely that there will be a favorable outcome, less likely that there'll be a disappointing outcome? So basically, we need to learn to think about the future in terms of probabilities rather than absolutes, just as in our analysis, our descriptive and explanatory analysis, as I said this morning, we have to think in terms of shades of gray and not simply in terms of black and white. So I'll stop there, turn over to my two longtime friends and colleagues to continue the discussion, and it's great to be with all of you here today. Thanks so much.
Well, good to hear you, Harry, again, and I'm going to make a prediction and not adhere to the caution you were implying we all should. I guess my bottom line is that I think I'm intrinsically an optimist. So this, what you're going to hear is not my emotional preference, it's at least my analysis. And I think we have not hit bottom. And I don't know where bottom is in the relationship. And what I want to just talk about is 5 attributes of the current situation that lead me in that regard. I thought this was an ambitious panel to be entitled The Past, Present, and Future, and you have 11 minutes to get it out. So I'm destined to fail, I would say. But I just got back from the Boao Forum in Hainan. That was an interesting place to be, particularly, I guess it was the launch site of the balloon, the infamous balloon, and then went to Hong Kong. But in any case, I gave a talk there, and as I was thinking about what to say, I recalled in late 1941, Prime Minister Tojo was thinking about the prospects of conflict with the United States and what the implication might be if there was a long war with the United States. And he said, occasionally, one must conjure up enough courage, close one's eyes, and jump off platform Kiramizu-dera, a famous temple in Kyoto. And I guess I see that that we collectively, leaders in the United States and in China, seem to be closing their eyes and their ears and contemplating taking steps that I think we really can't foresee the outcome. And there is almost something you might say too much deterrence. I often felt, in a way, the more you deter, the more you force somebody to act earlier to stop the evolution of an even more disadvantageous future circumstance. So I would want to call to your attention 5 things that I think are characterizations of our current circumstance. First of all, I think we are involved in a comprehensive breakdown in relations. And by that, I mean, I've always sort of conceived of the relationship as having sort of a 3-legged stool with a strategic component, with an economic component and a cultural diplomatic component. And it seems to me that the absolutely central important leg is the security leg. And for many years, 3-4 decades, basically security was a rationale for stronger US-China relations versus the Soviet Union and terrorism and so forth. Well, once that security leg begins to weaken, as I think we're all familiar with, that infects the economic relationship. And you begin to think how you can lever that economic relationship into security positive outcomes. And once you start talking about security, you begin to talk about innovation, and you begin to talk, you're pretty soon to research universities and exchange and who you're going to exclude or include and so on. So what I think is we've got a kind of comprehensive weakening of all 3 of these legs. Now, related to that, it seems to me in the past 40 years, basically, not always all the time, but basically the executive branch has been a kind of a guardian of that fundamental structure. And Congress, for much of the time, was, I don't want to say entirely in the background, but with the exception of the TRA and a few notable cases, basically the executive that was committed to a stable policy was able to deliver on it. I think Congress has been activated to the point where the administration doesn't necessarily want to control it, but is unable to do so even if it wanted to. So I see the governor in our own political system to be not functioning well. I would just call your attention to the Select Committee on Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party. This is, in a very polarized city, a bipartisan committee. So first of all, we've got a comprehensive breakdown and we don't have the governor in the relationship. I'm a sort of partial to executive power trying to modulate policy, and I see the governor in the situation weakening. Secondly, it seems to me, and this is very fundamental, that both sides have moved from what I would call a policy of reassurance to deterrence. And deterrence, whatever you want to say, is about threat, finding a threat that's unacceptable to the other side and will restrain them. Of course, you can't be sure it doesn't provoke them, but in any case, we've moved from assurance policies for 30+ years to now, I think both are quite openly pursuing deterrence policies. And we are in an arms race. There are no 2 ways about it. Just look at the increase in the warhead modernization program that China has, in fact, that the United States has. The NPC just announced a 7.5% defense increase. The US, I was looking through what the DOD has said about the fiscal 24 budget, and here's what they said on March 13th. This budget includes the largest ever request for the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. The PRC is our pacing threat, and every strategic document out there says China is the principal threat to our values and our interests. And that's been true both in the Trump administration and in the current administration. You look at Prime Minister Kishida announcing a doubling in the percentage of Japan's GDP that's going to go to defense over the next 5 years. So defense, increasing arms race, we're putting increasing amounts of hardware in increasingly confined spaces. Something's going to go wrong somewhere. It just seems almost statistically inevitable. Third, it seems to me that sort of the third big consideration here is that this is the 51st anniversary year of the Nixon trip. And to simplify, but not much, the undergirding idea was simply China and the United States creating enough of a two-front threat to the Soviet Union that it would be constraining. And now we see China and Russia moving closer to each other. And it's been the long-term commitment of US policy almost since the founding of the Republic that our objective was to never allow a single country or a coalition of countries to be hostile to the interests of the United States to dominate the Eurasian continent. And we find ourselves with a policy, and the Chinese are certainly in the Ukraine response, increasingly moving in the direction that's not strategically favorable to the United States. And you see it, Xi's visit to Putin in just last month. And you see it in Xi's earlier statement in the context of the NPC meetings about all around containment, encirclement, and suppression. So it seems to me that we now are in a situation of the Nixon strategic triangle standing on its head. And that seems to me intrinsically not in the interest of the United States. Fourth, it seems to me that ideology, and it was talked about this morning in at least one of the panels, is playing a bigger role in bilateral relations. And whatever you want to say about the Nixon, Mao, rapprochement, and the three communiques, they agreed that essentially each country's internal governance cannot be the decisive factor dictating how we're going to deal with each other. And yet, I think it's quite obvious in our very formulation of our foreign policy, the struggle between autocracy and democracies, that's fundamentally an ideological definition of the relationship. And China reads that as aspiration for regime change. I don't think we can expect very much cooperation when they see that as our underlying objective. So that leads me to be worried. And finally, it seems to me historically, as the US-China relationship becomes more contentious, Taiwan inevitably becomes more strategically meaningful and important to each of us. It becomes a more contentious, volatile issue in the relationship. I would argue when our strategic relations and economic and cultural relations were better between the United States and China, we had better, let's say, a more pacific and favorable to Taiwan set of relations. So I don't think increasing strategic tension is good for Taiwan, much less stability in the Taiwan Straits. Now, I just wanted to end, and then if you say this is our situation, what is our national capacity going to be? Are we training the talent we need to be able to deal with this evolving situation? And it seems to me that our capacity to learn about China from the inside out is beginning to diminish quite substantially. Just if you measure the number of American students that now have access to China are likely to in the future. Hong Kong can't play the role it played with the University Service Center in the 1970s and 80s. So the question is, how are we going to train the new generation? And what methodologies are they going to be able to use? And I must say, we're not picking the low-hanging fruit. I would have thought by now we might have got rid of tariffs. I would have thought maybe we could have restored aspects of the Fulbright program, but we're not even doing things that are, I would say, comparatively simple to do. So I would be glad to be disabused of my, let's say, sober or sobering analysis, but frankly, that's where I am.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I just want to begin by saying I could not be more pleased to share this panel with my two very close friends, Harry and Mike. I'm going to steal just a couple of my 15 to 20 minutes I was told I'm allotted, so I'm going to take a couple of those just at the outset. To take the opportunity to publicly acknowledge, I don't know the next time the three of us will ever be publicly together, but I would like to just acknowledge what both of you have meant to me in my career and my life. You are not only close colleagues, and colleagues don't always become friends, but in both cases you become very close friends of mine and each other. This is a very positive strategic triangle over the last 4+ decades. Not only colleagues and friends, but in my case, mentors. Harry and Mike have both been my professional mentors. They're a half generation ahead of me in the China field. Got their doctorates slightly ahead of me, but not only have I looked up to them over the years, but I've really learned enormous amounts from each of them. I first met Harry in 1978. If I recall, when he was the founding director of the East Asia program at the Woodrow Wilson Center here in Washington. And I first met Mike, I think memory serves, 2 years later in 1980 in Ann Arbor, Michigan, when you were a visiting scholar at the Center for Chinese Studies working on your book on elites politics. That's the first time I remember. That's a long time ago, folks. So we have a lot of history, three of us, and it's harmonious history. You know, if the US-China relationship could be even a fraction of what the three of us have enjoyed, it would be in a lot better shape. So as I say, each has had very real and very specific influences on my own thinking and understanding of China and US-China relations. And if it weren't for Harry, I would not have been selected by the Committee on Scholarly Communication of the People's Republic of China, an organization Mike used to direct, but not at that time, as a research student to go to China to do my own PhD dissertation research in 1983 to 85. I won't tell you that story, but Harry was responsible for my selection, and I therefore went to China, researched my dissertation, and became an academic. One of those points in life that could have gone the other way. And it went the way it did, and I went to China, wrote a dissertation, I became an academic. Otherwise, I'd probably have become a journalist or something else. I was telling Mike Chenoy the other night when he spoke here about my aspiration to become a journalist in the late 1970s, having gone to Hong Kong looking for journalism opportunities. Well, turns out I became an academic, but thank you, Harry, for that intervention. And it was Harry who, as dean here at the Elliott School, lured me back across the Atlantic from London to join the Elliott School faculty. And once I arrived back, Mike reached out to me numerous times and mentored me, and was really a role model for me here in Washington, how to navigate Washington, but most of all, how to be a public intellectual on China in this very political city. Not an easy thing. So I just want to take a couple minutes at the outset, because I don't know if I'd have another opportunity to thank both of you. So let me move on to what's left of my 15 to 20 minutes. So US-China relations, obviously at present, in the recent years, are at their lowest ebb in more than 30 years since the aftermath of Tiananmen in 1989. And in many ways, the relationship today, I think, is even worse than it was in the aftermath of Tiananmen in the 89 to 95 period. This time around, it was not a single event that triggered the downward spiral. The downward spiral has been progressive over a considerable period of time. I myself date it to the second Obama administration, 2012 to 16. It has crossed 3 administrations, Obama, Trump, and now Biden. That's about a decade. It is systemic across multiple domains and it is here to stay. As a consequence, in my view, the engagement paradigm is dead, 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 and not to return. So you know where I stand on that discussion. Now, what has replaced it is the question, and how should we think about the relationship? So I myself think of and describe the relationship between the United States and China today as one of indefinite, comprehensive, competitive rivalry. The indefinite, comprehensive, competitive rivalry. There's now primarily a competitive relationship in which each side seeks to strengthen itself vis-a-vis the other and takes actions and counteractions against the other. It is comprehensive in that it stretches across virtually all functional issue areas and all geographic regions of the world, including outer space, including the Arctic, the Antarctic, cyberspace, you name it. The US and China are competing everywhere against each other, not with, against. And has become a classic great power rivalry whereby each increasingly contests the other's presence and influence worldwide. It exhibits the classic reactive and escalatory elements of a security dilemma, which Mike just spoke. Harry spoke. It is not time bound, it is indefinite and can be expected to last indefinitely into the future. It shares many features of Cold War 1.0, but it also has some dissimilarities from Cold War 1.0. Now, let me just give you the features that I think characterize the relationship today, and here you will hear echoes of what you just heard from Harry and Mike. As I say, it's a comprehensive competition, and one intriguing aspect of that to me is the symmetry amongst the elements of the competition, the mirror imaging and symmetry across these multiple domains. So both view each other increasingly ideologically. I'm going to echo what Mike just said. Since the Trump administration, US officials have been at pains to note that it is the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, with which we Americans have our problems, not China or the Chinese people. That's been an interesting evolution that Trump administration started, and I think it's now embedded in the discourse. And it's an important clarification. Yeah, and I agree with it. It's the Communist Party with which we have problems. It's not China, and it's certainly not the Chinese people. Mike noted the title of the new Select Committee on Strategic Competition between the United States and not China, the Chinese Communist Party. That's very intentional for the Gallagher Committee, the way they term their mandate. So former Secretary of State Pompeo essentially called for regime change in his Reagan Library speech. President Biden personally approaches China via his democracy versus autocracy binary prism. And Republican candidate for president Nikki Haley regularly refers to communist China. Very interesting if you listen to her speeches. She doesn't say China. She doesn't say the Chinese Communist Party. She just says communist China. It's a real throwback to the 1950s and 1960s. Let's see. So on the Chinese side, for Xi Jinping of the Chinese Communist Party, the United States is also framed ideologically as trying to subvert CCP rule. They define it in terms of party, not nation, but in terms of party rule. There are even hints in Xi's speeches of socialism prevailing over capitalism, East rising, West declining, and so on. So this is an ideological struggle. Make no mistake about it. Secondly, commercially and economically, both sides mirror image and symmetrically reflect the other. Both sides are erecting barriers to certain types of FDI, so-called negative lists, areas you cannot invest in each country. Both are increasing export controls towards the other. It's not just Americans towards China. The Chinese have their own export controls and things that won't export to this country. And both are increasingly viewing normal business suspiciously. selective decoupling is a reality, as each side are closing off commercial opportunities on a selective basis and redirecting supply chains. China, for inputs from the United States and abroad into Chinese manufacturers, and for the United States outputs from goods manufactured in China. Thirdly, technologically, both sides are increasing subsidies to their domestic R&D and tech industries in an attempt to decouple and create autonomy in the tech domain from the other. So the whole premise about synergistic research and development, knowing no sovereign boundaries, sorry, that's not the way either the United States or China define it. Militarily, number 4, both sides are procuring specific weapon systems, undertaking specific training, undertaking specific deployments of forces, and specifically targeting the other's forces while wargaming very specific contingencies against the other. Both are preparing for possible war. And by the way, preparations for war go beyond those things I just mentioned. It includes actions that China is currently taking under Xi Jinping, stockpiling oil, stockpiling foodstuffs. I commend, by the way, the article in Foreign Affairs a week ago by Matt Pottinger and John Pomfrey. They go through all the things China is doing in a non-kinetic, non-military domains to prepare for war. Stockpile food, stockpile oil, other materials that a society would need if they were under attack. So just note that. 5th, in terms of domestic security and counterintelligence, each side views the other as the major security and espionage concern. And both sides have launched major internal security initiatives against the other. 6, in the media domain, both sides have engaged in tit-for-tat expulsions of journalists and limits on the numbers of journalists in each country, even after we managed to restore minimal numbers of American journalists in China. And both sides have considerably tightened up the monitoring of media in each country. And then lastly, in the civil society and sphere of academia, both sides increasingly monitor so-called influence operations, that's an American term, of the other. This has become a big issue and a big problem, a real issue and a real problem. It's not fake news, folks. In American academia, in American civil society, and in American think tanks. As a result of China's 2017 NGO law, the American and foreign NGO presence in China has plummeted from over 7,000 registered international NGOs when the law came into effect in 2017 to just 591 in 2021. 7,591 speaks volumes about the way the Chinese view such organizations and such types of epistemic, you want to call it that, scholarly or other just exchange. Why? Because they're fearful of so-called colored revolutions that they think were engineered in the former Soviet space by pro-democracy NGOs. Okay, so what's the common denominator? Let me wrap up here. To these 7 and other areas of acute competition and increasingly adversarial mutual perceptions. Answer, everything in the US-China relationship today has now been securitized on both sides. On the Chinese side, this was made abundantly clear in Xi Jinping's 20th Party Congress report, in which he used the term anshan, no fewer than 68 times. Came in second only to Fajian development in the speech. Not only were there 68 mentions, he specifically noted 16 different categories of national security, each category of which has several number of specific elements. So, so as a result, in China today, any interaction in any domain must now pass a so-called security and subversion test. In the United States, China is also viewed increasingly through a national security lens. So in conclusion, this, I'm afraid to say, is the new normal. There is no going back to the era of engagement and cooperation. We need to A, get used to it, get used to living with these frictions, but B, and here's where I will try to end on a more optimistic note, learn to manage them. The mutual goal for both governments should therefore be to deftly manage the multitude of competitive issues in ways that do not progressively bleed or inadvertently slide into conflict. Easier said than done. Managing fluid competition is like tending a garden. It requires constant attention and proactive management. Can also be thought of, or I think of, as a kind of sporting competition without end, where there's ebb and flow as each contestant advances and retreats on the playing field, but neither side wins or loses. If effectively managed, and by the way, there's no umpire. Another metaphor I like to use is this is a very dysfunctional, badly broken marriage in which there are no counselors. There's no therapy. You can't go, the two countries can't go to. But if effectively managed, I think a certain delicate equilibrium can be found and a relationship of competitive coexistence can be established. But to get there, proactive steps need to be taken by both sides to create the institutions and the procedures to actively constrain the increasingly dangerous competition. Now here, I think Cold War 1.0 offers some very poignant and useful lessons. Think back, folks, those of you who are old enough. I think we need to reopen the toolbox and dust off some of the tools from Cold War 1.0 and see if they may be applicable to this Cold War 2.0, which I think we're in. It's not future, it's now. It's happening. In my view, others will disagree with that, but I think we're in it. You want to call it cold or what? So a number of elements that we established during the détente phase with the Soviet Union, Nixon, Brezhnev period, that they established a series of protracted, multi-layered set of reinforcing processes. The détente from the Helsinki Accords to the Conference on Security Cooperation in Europe, CSCE, Track 2 exchanges, which have atrophied badly, as Mike has explained. These all need to be fully re-examined to potentially identify reusable ones. Yes, there were tripwires and red lines in Cold War 1.0. There are tripwires and red lines at present. But we have to go beyond tripwires and red lines, not just getting close to the other side's neuralgia. We have to figure out more positive ways to establish some processes that can limit. The Biden administration keeps talking about guardrails. That's what they're talking about, I think, but they don't really ever elaborate it publicly, at least. But if we can establish such processes to bound and regularize the competition, then hopefully catastrophic war might be avoided. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.
I'm Deborah Brodigan from Johns Hopkins University, SICE. I realized I didn't introduce myself before. And I'm pretty proud actually after that. So I'm glad that you ended on a uptick, David, about possibilities for this competition that we're facing right now in Cold War 2.0. We've learned from our speakers the future is contingent, the three legs of the relationship are shaky, and we haven't hit bottom yet. There's an action-reaction going on. And I'm sure that I have lots of things that I would like to ask, but I'm sure, let me just see if people are ready. Yes, yeah, I thought so. So I don't want to take, since I can talk to these guys anytime, I don't want to take the time. So let me ask you to introduce yourself first and then ask your question. So you in the front row.
Hello, I'm Satvik Pindiala. I am a grad student here at GW and a research assistant for the Rising Powers Initiative for the Senior Center here. My question is, the US's anti-China strategic partnerships in the Indo-Pacific, such as AUKUS or Quad, kind of show significant US commitment to security cooperation in the region. China characterizes these as an Asian NATO, regardless of the accuracy of the statement. But there seems to be increasing incentives to enhance security competition in the region. But which side do you think enjoys less first mover costs or fewer first mover costs to start for engagement rather than furthering competition?
I mean, who would find it easiest to begin to think positively and engage? Is that the question?
Which side has fewer costs?
Well, I guess the way I'd put it is no American would want to trade the set of problems that we have for the set of problems China has. I think we underestimate the constraints China's facing. And I think we intrinsically, right, China's by its own actions alienated a lot of the middle countries. It's trying to win them back, whether it's, Australia, New Zealand, Norway, Nordic countries, the EU, of all the various degrees. So I think China's in a deeper hole, and you could say, well, it's in worse shape, therefore they're more incentivized to improve it. But on the other hand, I think basically we're in a stronger position, and we can afford to look, I think, a little more long-term and be a little more accommodating. I mean, we have tariffs in an inflationary period. I'm not an economist, but that doesn't seem like the thing you'd choose to do as macroeconomic policy. We have a problem that we don't have enough people doing research in China and so on, and learning about China. So it seems to me we could move on the low-hanging fruit here. I think China ought to do a lot of things, but you asked who might find it easier to move. I think the penalties of reversing course for Xi Jinping are really rather high for him. I think he's not as secure as you might think, just having won a third term as president and chair, general secretary. So in a way, I'm not too comfortable with who would find it easier, because we can destroy all the domestic politics. It makes it, you could say Biden's got an election coming up, and the last thing he needs to do is look weak. And I would say that doesn't look so easy to a politician here, but I would like to see the United States make the first step.
Yes, I understood your question slightly differently, and I'd be interested in Harry's views on this too. I understood your question to be about the region and about the alliances, American alliances in the region, and how does that factor into the U.S.-China relation, America versus China in those terms? Well, in those terms, I think there's no comparison. China has no alliances, say, with North Korea. I think it's still active on the books, but friends like that, good grief. And China's other major partner in the region, Cambodia, great. I call it the 32nd province of the People's Republic of China. The United States alliance system, wide, deep, broad, stronger, more robust than ever. So, I wouldn't want to be in China's shoes. The U.S. is in a very strong position.
In the far back there.
Thank you also for doing this. I'm a national security correspondent with the Epoch Times. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about managing CCP and PLA potentialities regarding a conflict over Taiwan. If I could just frame my question with two brief quotes. In 2018, there was an internal Central Military Commission memo that said one of the key strategic goals of the PLA was to, quote, peaceably manage US decline. Now, fast forward to last week, General Mark Milley says that a majority of the PLA leadership believes, quote, that war with the United States is inevitable. So with that kind of framing, that significant shift in outlook in the PLA leadership, I was wondering, what can the United States do beyond cooling off the rhetoric, provide the CCP with alternative potentialities to try to deter or avert any type of military conflict between the two powers? Thank you.
Let me try to respond to these very, very interesting questions. I'm still thinking about the idea of the first mover advantage or the first mover disadvantage in trying to get the relationship back on track. And I think that I would also agree, I think, with what David and Mike have said, that I think that China feels that it pays the higher price. One of the problems that I've discovered when I've been in a public policy school is the assumption that all of these costs can be calculated with great precision, kind of a cost benefit analysis. And I think, again, those calculations are also probabilistic, and they also are as much immaterial as they are material. I think that basically China faces a serious reputational risk more than anything else. The Chinese for so long have put out the narrative, a self-narrative, that China never responds to pressure. That is a brilliant negotiating tactic if the other side believes it. In other words, if we're in a negotiation and basically I say, my position, take it or leave it. There's no room for concession. I don't respond to pressure. Then that is a wonderful advantage. And I think the Chinese, especially Xi Jinping, and I do think that he feels particularly vulnerable on a variety of dimensions that would feed into this reluctance, does not want to think that if he is the first mover, this is a response to American pressure. So I think he sees that there is a first mover disadvantage. What the Chinese are trying to do is to kind of work around that problem by being in a way, the first mover on an important but seemingly unrelated issue, and that is Ukraine, of course, where they are trying to rewrite the narrative about themselves to say that they are not just in the abstract loving peace, but that they can play a role to try to help mediate or resolve the conflict in Ukraine. Here, the problem is that they've not been able to come up with a particularly attractive solution. The idea of a ceasefire that many people are now saying is basically the Korean War model of an armistice that simply freezes the status quo and goes on forever, especially given the fact that the status quo is so favorable to Russia, having now occupied Ukraine and basically seized certain parts of Crimea and seized certain parts of Ukraine as well and incorporated them into Russia. To kind of freeze that situation would be a very unequal outcome. But I think that that's what China is trying to do, to be the first mover in a different arena where it thinks it would pay a lesser price because it's not paying a cost, but I think it's not going to gain much benefit. So I'll leave it at that. I think that China actually does see a reluctance to make the first move because it feels that it has been under pressure from the United States. We've heard all the phrases they use: containment, we're trying to isolate them, we're trying to surround them, we're trying to disrupt their rise, and to feel that they are responding to that pressure by making, kind of trying to make the first move towards the United States. I think would be very, very damaging to their self-image.
You quoted you were quoting the PLA and the implication, I don't mean, the implication I could have drawn from that is that you have a model of the Chinese political system in which the PLA is the dominant player. I don't think we're quite at Japan and the military of Japan in 1941 kind of situation. I think there are some big counterbalances perhaps to the PLA within. I mean, you certainly have the party, the writ large. And you have the state bureaucracy, you have provinces that are global actors by themselves. So I think the PLA is not the sole determinant of whether war or conflict or even a foreign policy of particular character. They're important players, and there's a lot we don't know, and David knows a lot more about it than I, but I'm not yet to the point where I think the PLA is sole possession of the reins of decision. Secondly, you sort of were asking, well, and within the framework, what can we do to lower the probability that the military is activated here? And it's not easy for us, and I'm not sure exactly how we would engineer it. But I think you'd have to say, what you think about it's a different question. But there's been a rather, from the Chinese point of view, rather rapid erosion of the, I don't want to quite say norms, but practices with which we dealt with Taiwan. The sort of unwritten but clear operational code for both sides about how we keep this thing contained. And that's been steadily eroded. I mean, just look at Speaker of the House visits in the last year. So I think we need to be more cautious, because this is, I think, the issue. And let me underscore my belief that Taiwan's going to be the biggest victim if this breaks down. So I think we're going to have to kind of come to an understanding with the Chinese where are the boundary lines here. And it's just interesting that Ma Ying-jeou was in China and leave today or tomorrow. But in any case, the period 2008 to 2016, whatever you want to say, was a pretty productive time in relative cross-strait relations. And I think that would be a period that's far preferable to what we find ourselves in now. My only realistic thought is it's hard to reestablish a status quo that's a decade plus old. But I think that we'd all be better off if we were in a situation that looked like that.
I'd make one other point, Deborah, that's something that we've been talking about. And that's the idea of guardrails. That obviously is a good idea conceptually, but I worry about its feasibility on either side. The Chinese have already made clear that they reject the concept, I think, of guardrails proposed by the Biden administration, because they see it as a way of constraining them. Guardrails are, of course, a way of preventing a car from going off the side of the road, and for them, guardrails are a way of preventing Chinese behavior that would be provocative to the United States. The Chinese have not used the term to describe their own policy. They, and Mike, you've written very eloquently and persuasively about it, was the idea of the new type of major power relationship, where the idea was that each side would promise to basically respect the red lines and core interests of the others. The problem for the United States was that the unspoken but very clear corollary was respect the interests of each side as each side defines them. So it was a kind of a blank check, so that these two concepts were both trying to do the same thing: limit the deterioration of the relationship, lay the foundation for improvement. But the way that it was formulated in each case was seen as unacceptable to the other side, which basically suggests the common problem. In a competition, it may be hard to agree on rules because each side will want the rules to favor them in the competition and will not want to be constrained in that competition, especially in the areas where it thinks it has an advantage. So I'm, again, very cautiously optimistic that this approach would actually irony.
Let's take 3 questions now. I think there's one on this side, and let's see, in the back. And one more on this side.
Michael Moore, Professor of Economics here at the Elliott School. And what I'd welcome Harry back. Served as an associate dean when he first arrived long ago, when I had a full head of hair. So it really was a long time ago. So, an obvious area of possible cooperation is on climate change. This is a global problem. It's not an individual country's problem. I'm not optimistic that the economic interests of the two sides are going to allow them to cooperate on climate change, although they're, boy, I wish they would. But is there anything that we might look for in concrete terms over the next 5 years, which might suggest that there would be cooperation, or will it be a continuation of the IRA and Inflation Reduction Act and other activities to steal economic activity either from China or from the US or whatever? But is there any hope, any reason to hope for a better outcome among climate change cooperation? Thank you.
Yes. Miles. Miles Kaler, American University in Kansas Relations. You mentioned the strength of American alliances, but I wanted to raise the issue that they could serve as a constraint on American policy. Europe has moved a considerable direction in the US view of China, but it's not anywhere close to where we are. The president of the European Commission recently made a speech. She's one of the more hawkish Europeans, and she called it de-risking, nothing like decoupling. German corporations continue to make very large investments in China. They're not going to give up on China economically the way that some in this country seem to be willing to do so. So that's one issue with some of our allies. The other issue, which I observed when I was in Europe recently, which is fascinating, is Europe has moved toward the US position because of the issue of human rights. And many of the most hawkish Europeans, particularly in Germany, are the Green Party, which is on the left. And it's largely because of what happened in Xinjiang and Hong Kong. And it's interesting, in all of your presentations, you didn't mention the issue of human rights. The word didn't even come up. So how do we manage that for the United States, where it's also a political issue, but also because it's driving the view of our allies in their position toward China?
And over here.
Yeah.
Thank you, Thomas Beermann, IFC. So 7 years ago, when I was allowed to give a speech, I said, when a country peaks, it's when an international financial institution, a development bank, is founded. Relatively peaks. 1945, the World Bank. 1960, with America as the anchor country. 1966, the Asian Development Bank. Japan as the anchor country. 1991, the Eastern European Bank for Reconstruction and Development with Germany after unification. In 2015, the AIIB in Beijing with China. And 18 months later in Davos, Xi came and he said, I'm the adult in the room, Trump is crazy, and I'm the guy for the harmonious world order. And that was the moment, January 2017, I think, when China peaked. When everybody was still buying this benevolent rise and playing by the rules and fitting in, and being the developing country and being the victim of the unequal treaties and having harboring this. But after that, it flipped. So my question is, how do you manage Cold War 2.0? How can we relearn 4.0? As a West German, I know how this works. Academia likes to think everybody is a partner, and development, everybody is a partner. But the DFC from America has another side. Academia in West Germany in the 80s had another side. So how do we get back essentially to the discipline we had that would help us to win 2.0 with the 80 million members of the Communist Party, aside from the 1.3 billion who are not members of the Communist Party?
I think we have 5 more minutes, is that right? 5 to 10? 5 to 10, okay, so let's hear from first.
Well, I'll lead off. I'll just offer personal view about Mike Moore's question about climate change. You know, it's a puzzle to me. I may be completely, probably am completely wrong about this, but I don't view climate change in the US-China relationship as a bilateral issue between the United States and China. Climate change is an issue for each side to comply with the COP standards unilaterally on their own. It's not something for the Americans and the Chinese to be negotiating with each other. There's the international community, there are the various COP summits that have taken place and the standards that are set for different countries. It's up to each country to bring their own domestic laws in compliance with those standards. So the United States and China are no different than Zimbabwe and Canada. So I don't get it, frankly, why this is even an issue for bilateral discussions and why John Kerry spends time talking to Xi Jinping about the issue. I think it's up to China to comply and it's up to America to comply. That's just my personal view. I may be really wrong on that, but I will take up the Europe question. I've spent a good part of the last 4 decades studying Europe-China relations. And I noted and read very carefully President von der Leyen's speech last week, which I commend to everybody. Everybody in this room, and everybody who works on China should read her speech to Merrick's in the European Policy Center last week. I've been studying this topic for over 40 years. It is, to my mind, the best, the toughest, and the most balanced document and speech I have seen from any European leader on China in 4 decades. Now, you note the term de-risking. Yeah, she used that term, but very narrowly and very specifically to apply only to the commercial realm. The speech encompasses all realms of Europe-China relations, including human rights. So de-risking versus decoupling, that was a very intentional term. I mean, you don't give a speech like that unless every comma is in the right place and every word has been vetted. And so it's a very important speech. And I think it captures extremely well the sea change, fundamental sea change has taken place across Europe, with 2 exceptions. I mean, across Europe, Scandinavia, throughout Central Europe, not entirely in the Mediterranean countries, and not entirely in Germany and France. I won't take time away from these other important questions. You're quite right to have noted the Greens in Germany. They're part of the so-called traffic light coalition. You know, the sea change has taken place in Europe, across Europe. All 27 countries is exemplified in her speech, but Chancellor Schulz's Social Democrats and President Macron, now in Beijing, these are the 2, I don't know what you call them. These are the 2 who haven't gotten the memo. They're not on the same page as the rest of the continent. Well, they're important leaders, pretty central to the, but so, you know, Europe has moved a lot closer to the United States on a variety of relations. This convergence, I've never seen closer transatlantic relations about China in 40 years than we have today. It's very positive. And human rights is very much a part of it, but it's by no means all of it. Last point, US and EU are not exactly on the same page, particularly on the commercial side. That's a big difference. But many of the other issues are all laid out in her speech, and you could read speeches by the Biden officials. I wish a Biden official would give a speech like she gave. I commend her. I just wish the American government officials would have the same. You know, we have one speech here at GW by Secretary of State Blinken a year and a half ago. They've been in office for 2.5 years. We've had one speech on China. Good grief. Anyway, that's all in there.
Well, I'd associate myself with what David said on the alliance question, just to reemphasize, though I think they will break from us or separate on the economic side more than on the security side, but I am struck by the degree to which they've gone along on the internet set of questions, Huawei and all of this, as that we're getting more cooperation, getting Britain and the United States to part with technology for submarines with Australia is certainly, I think, quite striking. So I think that's when I talked about, I think the US is in a strong position. I had that in mind. And one of the inconsistencies from my point of view, if I was thinking about Chinese interests, is how they've alienated what I would call the middle powers, both in Asia and Europe. But another question was, so how do we manage or think about managing Cold War 2.0? And there are problems with every suggestion, but I would think part of the mix needs to be arms control discussions. Now, the Chinese and where they're ahead, they don't want to negotiate a way being ahead, and where they're behind, they don't want to lock in their inferiority. So the Chinese have been consistently resistant to arms control. But that, I think, is essential, particularly in terms of getting more and more equipment in confined spaces and accidents and miscalculations and protocols for encounters at sea and in the air and so forth. It's going to be much more complicated than Cold War I, though, because now we're competing in cyberspace, which wasn't a zone for the most part of. So how we're going to manage that space, I don't know. Another thing is that we don't like the idea of spheres of influence. We shouldn't like the idea of spheres of influence, but it is true that big powers like a buffer around their borders. And I think we kind of need to slack off a little bit on this close-in surveillance. I would think we need to be more respectful of each other's sensitivities around our border. Now, what that boils down to is specific and so forth. And we don't necessarily have to have an agreement. We can just be more respectful and state we expect them to reciprocate. If there's no reciprocation, so forth. And then I think, frankly, it sounds so retro after 51 years, but we've somehow got to credibly reaffirm the contours of the one China policy. China thinks we've got a one Taiwan, one China policy. And frankly, I'm hard pressed to disabuse them of that idea. And I think that's just going to be bad for everybody.
Perhaps I can say a few words. I'll take the last point that Mike made first, since I do spend a lot of time living on Taiwan. The one China policy, as set out originally in the Shanghai Communique, was based on basically what has become a fiction. As you remember, either a tautology or a fiction, when it masterfully said all Chinese on both sides of the Taiwan Strait maintain that there is one China and Taiwan is part of China. That was true by tautology, because not all Taiwanese, even at that time, regard themselves as Chinese. So it's true that those on Taiwan who thought themselves to be Chinese thought there was one China and Taiwan was part of China. Of course, at that time, they really thought that the mainland was part of the Republic of China. But the point is, Taiwan's identity has changed, and that China wants us to basically deny the fact that Taiwan exists. It's the center of the world economy to a degree never before, that its people regard themselves as separate from China with their own identity, their own values. And so it depends on how we define the one China policy. But if it means that we believe, and we never said this, of course, in 1972 or elsewhere, that we see the only future for Taiwan as being unification, whether or not the Taiwanese people want it. I don't think we can define that. And if we say that our one China policy means that we have to pretend that Taiwan does not exist as a significant entity economically and politically, we can't do that. What we can do is what I think we have done, is to say there will be certain limits on the kinds of relationship we have with Taiwan. And that we will have what we call a robust unofficial relationship that indeed has worked extremely well for Taiwan over the years. The problem with the Taiwan situation is that basically each side, and there are three sides, the United States, China, and Taiwan, are basically being urged to accept their second choice. For the United States, we would love to have a peaceful settlement that basically gets it all done over and done with forever. China, of course, wants unification with Taiwan. Many Taiwanese, not yet all, but most, I think, want to be independent. They accept the status quo because it's their second choice. But at some point in this kind of relationship, one party or another will decide to hell with it. The second choice is no longer acceptable to me. I want to go for my first choice because I deserve it. Of course, the party that is most likely to think it can get away with that change is mainland China, who will say, we don't accept that status quo, we want unification. So I'm concerned about Taiwan. Just one point on Mike Moore's comment about the United States and China negotiating the climate change issue. I agree there with David. That idea originally was Fred Bergsten in his foreign affairs articles, were called the G2 articles, and it didn't work then, and I don't think Mike is going to work now for the reasons that that David has said. It's not just the two of us, and we are, as everybody has said. The question each side is going to ask who pays more, who loses more, relatively or absolutely in that supposedly cooperative relationship. I'm not optimistic that climate change will be what brings us back together again.
I'm getting the message that we can have one more round of questions. So if you have to leave, please do. If you have something else you have to go to, but otherwise, to the lady next to the gentleman.
Great.
That narrows it down.
Thank you. I'm Mary Moran. I wanted to follow up on Mike's point earlier about different sets of problems and how Xi Jinping is not really solid as he thinks. We hear the economic news coming out of China today where you have thousands of elderly people protesting throughout China because their benefits are being cut, their medical care is being cut, their retirement age is raising. How do you see Beijing responding to those protests?
Talking about France or China?
Let's get two more questions.
US
out
in
there.
5 years.
And the frontier, and one more. The gentleman next to the lady.
Thank you. Jose Rivera, I'm a graduate student here at Elliott, and I wanted to ask if you had some predictions on what's been China's extension of their influence within our region. I'm talking about Mexico getting closer to China. I'm talking about El Salvador, who cut ties with Taiwan in favor of China, and as recently as 2 weeks ago, Honduras went the same way. So just wanted to know some predictions on that. Thank you.
And there was one more person, yes, over here.
Thank you. Bart Adash with McGill University's Institute for the Study of International Development and the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. There has been a lot written recently about the Belt and Road Initiative, about how it has been evolving, about the debt situation in many countries. I just would be interested in your assessment of, is it still going? Does it have a future? What does this evolution mean? Thank you.
We address these in which order? Does it matter? You want to just go down the line?
Yeah, just start.
Well, then I'll do the BRI. Because I wrote a book with two colleagues on the building of high-speed rail from southern China to Singapore, so it's on my mind. First of all, I think you have to start from the premise that what's a BRI project and what isn't is a huge area, gray area with entrepreneurial state enterprises, provinces, all trying to cram their pet projects under this sanction umbrella so they get benefits from the central government. So the boundaries of BRI itself are very unclear, but as nearly as we can tell, and Deborah knows more, and I hope she'll know much more than I know about it globally. My sense is that they're scaling back the rate at which they're making new commitments for infrastructure. I remember a Chinese official came by my office one day at the height of when Xi Jinping was traveling before COVID, and it seemed like every stop he was making, he was promising between 30 and $50 billion. And he was saying, I'm responsible for trying to follow along and implement this, but we don't have the capital, we don't have the technology, we don't have the people, we're getting overcommitted here. Also, there are many poor people in China. Wonder why China's putting money into Laos when, thank you very much, there are a lot of Chinese that could use the help. So it's controversial there. So my sense it's getting scaled back, but I don't think they've abandoned. And I would actually say, if I was thinking in their strategic interests, I wouldn't do away with the entire idea. They're trying to make China the hub of the East Asian and eventually Central Asian economy, and they believe that most people in the region, many developing countries, you're gonna get rich, build a road. And we haven't met that, the World Bank and a lot of the funders have been sort of off big infrastructure projects. And so China's building out an economic structure that's directing the flow of goods and human resources towards China. And that seems to me, on the face of it, a kind of rational, big picture. Now, it's run into lots of bad debts. That's not only a problem for Laos, but it's a problem for China as well. So I think they're learning to scale back their commitments, but I don't think they've abandoned the vision. And frankly, I don't think they should abandon the vision. It's been the implementation that's been the big problem, but you correct me, please, Dan.
I'll wait till we have a conference on that topic. But I was gonna say there has certainly been recalibration, but it's not over.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I would only respond to the Latin America question. I've spent some time in Latin America looking at China's relations with different countries there. And first thing I need to do is commend my colleague Stephen Kaplan, who's sitting in the back, book on China, Latin American political economy. Steve, tell me the title, I'll plug it.
Globalizing patient capital.
That's a superb study. But I looked at those relationships quite a lot during my research in China Goes Global, and I've continued to follow it. It's not just a question of which countries still recognize Taiwan and not. That's not the way to look at it, I don't think. In fact, of the 11 countries in the world, I think we're down to that Taiwan is down to, in terms of diplomatic relations, 2 are, I believe, Paraguay and one Central American country. Well, most of them are, but that's not the issue. The issue is the PRC's footprint throughout the hemisphere. That's the issue. It's mainly a commercial footprint, but it is more of a security and military footprint than people appreciate, particularly with Argentina and Brazil, and possibly Chile. But to go into some details, but China is very present. I think the trade related numbers are now about $700 billion a year in trade. Government know better than I, 600-700 billion with the entire hemisphere. China's really. So this is a subject that has not received due attention except from Professor Kaplan and some others, Deborah, and there are some people. Carol Wise, I would really recommend her book. What's it called? She's Southern California. Dragonomics, absolutely first-rate study, very comprehensive. But you're looking for, if people are looking for new areas of US-China contestation in the world, Latin America is it. Keep your eye on Latin America and the Middle East, as we've now seen with the recent Iran-Saudi broker deal in an area that the Americans have had a rather predominant role for a very long time. Well, that applies to Latin America too, but a lot of countries, it's like Africa, 52 countries in Africa. I don't know how many there are in this hemisphere, 27 members of the European Union. It's very difficult to generalize about these regions, 10 in Southeast Asia. So, we just can't sort of have throwaway takeaways about these regions, Middle East, China that, Europe, China this, very complicated. Chile's relations is very different than Paraguay's relations, very different than Mexico's relations. So it's people looking for dissertation topics and nice places to do research, I might tell you, by the way. Latin America, good place to do research. Very, very interesting set of case studies.
And no jet lag when you have to fly there.
But still a lot to say, even though time is running out. I think as I look at China, what it is trying to do is in many ways mirror imaging its rival, the United States. And it feels that the United States is trying to mobilize its friends and allies in the Asia Pacific region to support its initiative towards China, however we define it, however the Chinese define it. And so basically in mirror imaging, they want to then move into and compete with the United States in what we see as our backyard, which is exactly Latin America. And so I think that there's a lot of mirror imaging going on. Each is now competing. It feels strong enough to compete in the area that the other has seen as its natural sphere of influence for many centuries now. And we just have to be alert to that. The other, and I think also equally important, and it relates very much to the AIIB and to Melvin Rowe, is to fill in gaps. I think many years ago now, and David may remember, I think it was Scott Borman who wrote a book on applying Wei Chi to Chinese strategy. And basically, a lot of Wei Chi, I don't play it at all, but as I understand his argument, a lot of it is strategic location. And basically, you fill in the gap that you think is the key place on the board that is not yet occupied by the other player. And I think that this is what's happening. China is trying to fill in what it sees as enormous gaps that are left by the neglect of the United States, very, very frankly. So that explains the initiative on Ukraine. I don't think it's going to succeed, but there it is. The United States is so locked into the idea of no compromise, victory over Russia. So China can play that role, as many parts of the world are having kind of fatigue about and concern about an endless war in Ukraine. AIIB and BRI were a reaction, and I experienced this to a degree personally when I was a consultant to the Asian Development Bank. The United States was saying all this emphasis on hard infrastructure that really misses the point. All of that has to do with corruption, and basically people, leaders are skimming stuff off the top. We need to focus on soft infrastructure, not hard infrastructure, on basically civil society, improving judicial and legislative systems, improving the press. Asia Foundation, which Inez and I both were involved in, was involved in that in some ways as well. And so basically, developing countries, especially in Asia, were saying, but we still need hard infrastructure. And so the Chinese moved into to fill that gap. So I think a lot of it is the result of the United States kind of keeping its eyes off the ball and basically scoring own goals by neglect. And the Chinese are very quick to try to move into that. How effectively they do it is a different question. The BRI, as we heard, it depends on what the recipient country is, and especially the mechanisms that the Chinese have used, whether it's basically commercial lending or whether it is official governance. They give very few grants, as I understand. They are, we were told, Shirley and I in India, are the largest official creditor in the world now. They claim to be the leader of the South. One could argue they're part of the North these days in terms of their level of development, the size of their economy, and above all, their position as a leading official creditor. So they've got a looming reputational problem too, but so do we, and they fill in the gaps that we need.
Well, I'd like to thank our three panelists and then turn it over to the organizers of the conference.
Thank you, everyone. I just, on behalf of the organizing committee and IIEP and the Elliott School, if I may, I want to thank everybody for coming, for participating in this conference, our 15th anniversary conference. And also want to thank all the panelists for sharing their insights, for filling a lot of gaps in my understanding of the US-China relations. It's a great pleasure to have everybody here, and I hope everybody continues to stay engaged with IIEP and not just this initiative, but other initiatives, other work we are doing. Thank you again. Have a great weekend. Thank you, everybody.